My name is Luis Salgado. This is my entertainment story analysis for media and society. My favorite show ever is The Sopranos. As you can see by my shirt, The Sopranos, starring James Gandolfini as Tony Soprano, was directed by David Chase and was first aired in 1999. And season 6, its final season, aired in 2007. And the 3 episodes I watched for this project were the final 3 episodes of the series, season 6, episodes 19 through 21. The main character, Tony Soprano, is a mafia boss, and at this point in time, the show takes place from 1999 to 2007 as well. The mafia is on its way out, and Tony is struggling to balance his real family, his wife, Carmela, AJ, and Meadow, his 2 children, with his other family, the Soprano family, aka the DeMeo crime crew in New Jersey. The director, David Chase, grew up, he was born in New York, and he's an Italian. And David Chase fell in love with films like Goodfellas, Scarface, and The Godfather. The Sopranos actually makes a lot of references to these classic movies. And David Chase wanted to highlight through The Sopranos what the Italian community in America went through, or more so, how people viewed them based on how they were portrayed in those iconic films in the 70s and 80s. What I want to talk about today is how Italians specifically in The Sopranos faced sort of a tipping point in this era in the DeMeo crime family, and that is represented through Tony's struggles and the conflicts that arise between his family and his work life, aka his mafia life, as well as the many ways that David Chase, through the story, conveys how Italians, a resilient community, overcame a lot of negative publicity that may or may not be justified. And although The Sopranos itself is full of violence and full of horrific scenes, Chase doesn't necessarily want us to believe that he condones it. As a matter of fact, he uses violence and the horrendous actions of its characters to highlight just how damaging portrayals can be towards people. For this analysis, I watched the final 3 episodes of the series, episodes 19 through 21 of the 6th season. Episode 19, The Second Coming, opens up with Tony's son, AJ, actually attempting suicide. And Tony comes home at the perfect time to stop and save AJ after his failed suicide attempt. And Tony actually holds him dear and calls him his baby and tells him that everything's going to be okay. At this point in the series, it's really critical to Tony's character because he has battled through depression all throughout the series, and now he is starting to see that his own son, his flesh and blood, is battling through the same thing, and this really eats at Tony. However, his saving of his son represents Italians' resilience, as David Larry writes in his book, Reading The Sopranos, writes that David Chase does a brilliant job throughout the series of showing Italians in very hard situations to overcome, yet having that resilience to overcome that adversity. And I think that's a beautiful way to put it, because throughout the show we can see that Tony, even though his problems might be self-inflicted, he time and time again finds a way to stay on top as mafia boss and also have a relatively okay relationship with his son, who even at his lowest moments he still has enough love to take care of. Tony and AJ share a lot of similarities in their depression, and it's really highlighted how the perspective has changed from the generation who watched this show in 2007 versus the generation, my generation, who watched it, maybe a few years ago. How the show was seen more of as a crime drama and the family stuff was more annoying, versus how nowadays we kind of see it as a representation of not only just Italian America but greater America, how things have seemingly gotten worse and we seem to be fighting an uphill battle most of the time, especially young Americans and young minorities such as the Italians. It's important to also note the racial messages sent through the show, because AJ attempted his suicide after being depressed because his fraternity friends had beaten up a homeless black man. And David Chase also does an excellent job of portraying blacks and Italians in their conflicts and their resolutions as well, because many times throughout the show, Italians and black people work together to solve problems. And that was a critique of the shows of the 70s and a lot of the earlier representations of blacks was seen as kind of rude and maybe not as flattering. And so David Chase does a great job remedying that in the show, especially in the later parts of the seasons. Now, it's important to note that in this episode, another family issue arose when Coco, a soldier in the New York Lupertazzi family, which is currently in a war against the Soprano family of New Jersey, he makes a very inappropriate remark to Meadow, and in retaliation, Tony comes all the way to New York to defend his daughter's honor, and he beats Coco severely. Now, New York boss Phil Leotardo, he is already at odds with Tony. They have already been fighting over asbestos trucks, and Phil was refusing to argue or negotiate with Tony, so Tony was already at odds with Phil, and the beating of Coco had sent the conflict over the tipping point. And Do That wrote in the New York Times article Why Young People Are Watching The Sopranos that season 6 episode 20 is a perfect representation of why young people are watching The Sopranos. Young people resonate so much with the show because, like Tony in this episode, he lost everything. He lost his right-hand man, Bobby Bacalieri, his sister's husband, and his other right-hand man, Silvio Dante, who was a show favorite. And it goes to show that even though Tony had the woman, the money, and everything, the life he could ever dreamed of, the so-called American dream, Tony still lost it all. And it shows how this life of violence and crime doesn't go unpunished. Tony learned his lesson the hard way. He tried his best to protect his men, but he couldn't even protect those who were closest to him in the chain of command. Now, this episode also features a plan to whack Phil Leotardo, in which Tony sends Paulie to do. And Paulie hires 2 Italian men who attempt to assassinate Phil Leotardo, the New York boss. However, they misidentify him and instead kill 2 civilians. So Phil Leotardo hears about this and goes into hiding. Now Phil hides in Long Island. However, Tony doesn't know that yet. And that's when the war really goes to the next level. Silvio and Bobby Bacalieri are dead, and so the rest of the remaining crew go into hiding. Meanwhile, Tony sends his actual family, his wife Carmela and his 2 children, into their other beach house. At this point, the Sopranos family was nearly decapitated. However, Phil is very upset that he couldn't kill Tony. However, the Sopranos family needs time to recuperate after their loss, and so Tony devises a plan to get back at Phil. And that sets us up for the final episode, Made in America. Made in America features the most controversial ending in all of television history. When I was watching it, I honestly could not believe the ending. Even though I knew it was coming, I still could not believe it turned out the way it did. Fun fact, the series finale, Made in America, was actually just a second episode directed by David Chase, the director himself. He also directed the pilot episode, season 1, episode 1. So he's kind of finishing and ending the show. There's a lot of motif of death, which a lot of younger audiences picked up on as well, which the older generations didn't pick up on, which is interesting. And even though at the time the show was released, the ending was already controversial, the new era, my generation, really put a whole lot of new meaning, especially in this final episode, Made in America. According to YouTuber Rune Kino, which is a pretty famous YouTuber and sort of Sopranos expert, this show has, like I said, motifs of death, and the show opens up with Tony in a casket. It looks like he's actually sleeping in his own bed, but he has his arms crossed, and the camera makes it seem as though he's dead. And this is not the first time that it is hinted that Tony will die in the final shot. Now, Tony meets Agent Harris, who is a FBI director assigned to the Tony Soprano RICO case, and Agent Harris actually develops a soft spot for Tony, and so he willingly gives up information on Phil Leotardo. And it's interesting, this conflict, because it also represents another racial tension between Italians and other groups, in this case Arabs, because Agent Harris is assigned to the anti-terrorist task force following 9/11, and so Tony is giving up information on Arab drug traffickers. It's crazy how much race really played into the film, and how much race, or not the film, excuse me, the show, especially this final episode, because throughout the show there had been racial conflicts and racial resolutions following the Tony Soprano crime family. Butchie, which is Phil Leotardo's underboss, the New York crime family, he's really unhappy because Phil Leotardo, he feels as though, is missing the point of the crime family. He's tearing down ways to make money instead of making new ways to make money. And so Butchie devises a plan with Tony Soprano behind his back and gives him his location. And he also gives restitution to Janice, which is Tony's sister and Bobby's widow, for the murder, which also symbolizes Italians' ability to work together, even though for so long they were represented in media as just monsters who killed each other for seemingly no reason. It is also important, a lot of metaphors of haunting ghosts, such as the cat seen at the Bing, and Paulie calls it a snake with fur, and a lot of fan theories posit that cat was Adriana, which is Christopher Moltisanti's ex-wife. And Tony Soprano actually murdered Christopher, his nephew, earlier in the season. And so just another motif appearance of death there for Tony. Phil Leotardo is found by Tony's men, and he is whacked. And Tony actually hears about this and is elated and believes he has time to relax. And so his family decide to go to a restaurant and enjoy some onion rings. And that is when Tony Soprano is seemingly shot to death. Now, the camera shows a lot of suspicious men walking through the restaurant. However, the show cuts to black, which is a callback to earlier in the show about how the time you die, if you're ever whacked, you probably don't even know it's coming. And that'll wrap up my evaluation of the 3 episodes. But back to David Chase's argument that he was making through the show, was that Italians for the longest time were portrayed as a people who were battling wars over crime and maybe weren't represented the best in media because of viral movies such as Godfather, Goodfellas, Scarface, and the like. And David Chase wanted to put a show version of that type of media and not glorify the violence, but show how that violence can destroy Tony, as it destroyed his son with depression, how it destroyed Tony's closest family, and how it eventually led to his death. And he did a great job in these final 3 episodes of bringing a lot of storylines together and letting the audience have a lot to think about and ruminate on following the show's conclusion. So thank you. That's my analysis. Appreciate it.